It was a question no man ever expects to hear, least of all from a child he's never met. "Sir," she whispered through the slats of an orphanage fence, her voice trembling, "could you pretend to be my daddy just for one day? For Samuel Wyatt, a lonely widower who thought his heart was buried with his wife, this plea was more than a strange request. It was a terrifying spark in the darkness of his life, a spark that promised to lead him toward salvation, or a mortal danger he could not yet comprehend. The silence in Samuel Wyatt's heart had long ago settled into a permanent quiet, a hollow space where laughter used to live. He was securing his mule to the hitching post outside the mercantile, the familiar weight of a burlap sack of provisions under his arm. In his pocket was a list of chores, a catalog of movements with no real meaning, just another turn of the wheel to mark another day's passing. It had been 3 long winters since Evelyn was laid to rest, 3 seasons of colorless. Days that bled one into the next, each one a little grayer than the last. He ate enough to quell the hunger, slept enough to dull the ache, and asked for nothing more. He was turning to leave when a voice, thin as a bird's call on the wind, snagged his attention. "Mister?" It was faint, hesitant. He scanned the dusty road, the weathered storefronts. "Nothing down here, mister." His eyes fell lower, toward the peeling white fence that enclosed the Adeline home for children. And there she stood, a little wisp of a thing on the other side of the gate. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with a thin frame and a dress that had seen far better seasons. A sprinkle of sun-kissed freckles lay scattered across a nose that seemed made for pondering the shapes of clouds, but it was her eyes that made the world stand still. They were a deep, soulful brown, holding a sorrow that a child should never. No, they were Evelyn's eyes, he thought with a jolt, the same shade of impossible grief he'd seen in them. The day she said her last goodbye, he felt a roughness in his throat and had to clear it. "Are you the one callin' for me?" She gave a small, jerky nod, her fingers wrapping tighter around a wooden picket, as if holding on for dear life. He shifted the weight of the sack. "Well, what is it you're needing, child?" Her small lips trembled, not with cold, but with a hope so fragile it almost hurt to look at. It was worse than fear, somehow, that raw hope, because Samuel knew he had none of it left to offer. "Could you," she started, the words barely a whisper, "could you, just for one day, act as if you were my father?" The provisions nearly slipped from his grasp. The world narrowed to the small, earnest face staring at him through the fence. His own throat felt as dry as the dust on his boots. "What did you say?" Her little hands clenched the wood, knuckles white. "Just one day, that's all I need, so they won't send me off." Behind her, the orphanage door creaked open. A woman's voice, starched and weary, called out from the shadows of the porch. The girl's head snapped around, and when she looked back at him, her eyes were wide with a flicker of pure terror. "Please, mister, just pretend. I promise I'll be no bother." The door opened wider. She looked ready to bolt. He didn't know what ghost moved his lips, what long-buried instinct rose up from the dust of his soul. But a word escaped him before he could call it back. "All right," he heard himself say, his voice a low rumble. "I'll be your daddy." At that moment, the woman from the orphanage stepped onto the porch. She was a stern figure with her arms crossed, her face set in a permanent frown. "Margaret Ann, what have I told you about bothering folks?" The girl's name was Margaret. Before the matron could utter another syllable, Samuel took a step forward. "It's fine, ma'am," he said, surprised at the steadiness in his own voice. "I was just coming to fetch her. Figured it was about time." The matron blinked, her stern mask faltering for a second. "And you are?" He unlatched the gate and stepped through, placing a hand gently on the girl's hair. It was as soft as dandelion fluff. "Samuel Wyatt," he said, "her father." Margaret froze beside him, a statue carved from disbelief. The matron's eyes narrowed with suspicion. She never mentioned a father was due. Been here nearly 6 months. Samuel let a genuine weariness settle into his voice, the kind of tired that came from a grief too deep for lies. I've been on her trail all this time. Word gets tangled up, you know. Had papers filed up in Bozeman. It was a shot in the V. Dark, but the exhaustion in his posture made it believable. The woman's lips pursed. Well, there will be forms to sign. Verification will be required. Of course, Samuel said. Without looking up, Margaret reached out and her small, trusting hand slipped into his. He let his fingers close around it. The matron gave them both a long, hard look. Well, don't just stand there in the yard. You'll have to come inside. Speak with the clerk. Samuel nodded. Lead the way. As they walked toward the imposing front door, Margaret risked a glance up at him. Her eyes weren't filled with sorrow anymore. They were filled with a kind of wonder, as if he'd just reached down and plucked a star from the sky just for her. The air inside the Adeline home smelled of lye soap and boiled laundry, an antiseptic scent that couldn't quite cover the underlying notes of quiet desperation. As they followed the matron down a long, dim hallway, Samuel felt the eyes of the other children on them. They peeked from doorways, their faces holding either a sharp-edged envy or a dull, polished emptiness. Through it all, Margaret's small hand never left his, a silent, anchoring weight dot in a cramped office that smelled of old paper and dust. A clerk with spectacles pushed forms across a heavy oak desk, while the man rummaged in a filing cabinet. Margaret leaned in close to Samuel. "Thank you," she whispered, the words so soft he barely caught them. He crouched down to her level, his knees creaking in protest. A fatherly instinct he thought long dead stirred within him. "A person ought not to tell falsehoods, little one," he said. His voice gentled that her face fell. The brief flicker of light in her eyes extinguished. "I know," she began, her chin trembling, "but they were going to send me off. A man came. He had a wagon with iron-barred crates on the back. Like for animals." A cold dread trickled down Samuel's spine. "Crates?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. "He told the matron I was too small for any real work. Said I'd be the first one to go." Something hot and unfamiliar coiled in Samuel's gut. It had been years since he'd felt anything so sharp, so clear. It felt like rage. The clerk returned, and the next few minutes were a blur of scratched signatures and feigned paternal confidence. Margaret's hand remained locked in his. When they finally stepped back out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight, she squinted up at the sky as if seeing it for the first time. "Is your home very far?" she asked as he lifted her onto the wagon seat. She weighed almost nothing. "An hour's ride," he told her, guiding the mule onto the trail leading out of town, up where the pines grow thick. He watched her settle into a rough spun blanket as if it were the finest down. "Have you spent much time amongst the trees?" She offered him a small, hesitant smile, the first he had seen. "Only the ones in picture books." As the town and the orphanage vanished behind them, a silence settled between them, comfortable and deep. Finally, he had to ask, "Of all the men who passed by that fence, what made you choose me?" She hugged her knees to her chest, thinking for a long moment. "Your eyes," she whispered, not looking at him. They were quiet. Like they'd already lost everything they were meant to hold. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had no reply. He simply kept his gaze on the trail ahead. That evening, he made a simple stew of potatoes and carrots. As Margaret sat at his small table, her legs swinging, she hummed a soft, tuneless melody. For the first time in 3 years, the cabin was filled with a sound other than the wind or his own quiet breathing. He found an old linen shirt of Evelyn's, tucked away in a cedar chest, and carefully rolled up the sleeves for her to wear as a NIGHTG OWN. Later, as she curled up by the hearth, the firelight dancing on her face, she spoke into the quiet. "You don't have to keep this up tomorrow," she said, her voice drowsy with sleep. "I can tell them I was mixed up. They won't hold it against you." Samuel stared into the crackling flames at the way the light made her look so small, so fragile. "No," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "We'll keep pretending, for a while longer." He stood, intending to stoke the fire one last time before turning in. But as he reached the cabin door, a sound from the deep woods made him freeze. It was faint at first, almost lost in the rustle of the pines, the distant, unmistakable rattle of wagon wheels and the soft clink of a harness. And then, a voice carried on the night air, a low and searching call that was not meant to bring comfort. "Little girl, where have you run off to?" It was the voice of a hunter circling its prey, and Samuel knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the pretense was already over. The fire popped in the hearth, but Samuel didn't turn. He stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the warm light, listening to the sounds of the hunter in the dark. The voice faded, the wagon wheels grew faint, but the threat remained, hanging in the cool night air like a frost that wouldn't thaw. He carefully closed the heavy plank door and slid the iron bolts at the top and bottom. The sound of the metal seating into place was solid, final. His cabin wasn't a fortress. It was a single room with a loft, built with his own hands to shelter. A life that was now gone. Yet tonight, it held something impossibly precious. He turned and looked at Margaret, curled on the old sofa, lost in the trusting sleep of the innocent. Evelyn's shawl was draped over her small shoulders, and her hands were still balled into tiny fists, as if she were braced for a blow, even in her dreams. This wasn't a game anymore. It wasn't a favor for a frightened child. The word he'd given father had taken root in his soul. He moved to the back wall, his steps silent on the worn floorboards. He took down his rifle from its deer antler hooks. The steel was cold, the walnut stock smooth and familiar in his hands. He hadn't touched it for anything serious since Evelyn passed, but his hands hadn't forgotten the weight of it, the responsibility it carried. He stood watch by the window for the rest of the night, his gaze fixed on the dark, silent woods dot by morning. Margaret was awake before him, standing barefoot on the porch as the sun broke over the mountain ridge. She watched the sky turn from bruised purple to brilliant gold, as if it were a miracle crafted just for her. "Does this place truly belong to you?" she asked when she heard him step out. He nodded, rubbing the grit of a sleepless night from his eyes. She smiled that small, hesitant smile again. "I've never known a house could smell like coffee and pine sawdust all at once." He managed a slight chuckle. "That's what happens when you're too tired to sweep up after cutting firewood." He handed her a tin cup of warm milk with a drop of honey swirled in. She sipped it with a reverence usually reserved for Sunday sermons. Her next question came out in a whisper, barely disturbing the morning air. "Do I have to return?" Samuel paused, looking out at the vast expanse of his land. "Not today," he said, his voice quiet but firm, her shoulders slumped a little. "That's what they always say at the home." He crouched beside her, so their eyes were level. "Margaret," he said, the name feeling more natural on his tongue now. "I didn't bring you all the way out here for a single day. If you've a mind to stay, I'll find a way to make it stick." She turned her head, slowly, her gaze searching his. "Even if I'm not really your own?" He swallowed against a sudden tightness in his chest. "Maybe," he said, the admission raw and honest. "Maybe I was the one who needed finding." Her eyes glistened. Can I call you Papa?" The word struck him not as a sound, but as a physical thing, something with weight and substance. It landed in that hollow place in his chest and filled it whole. He couldn't speak, so he just nodded once. "Yeah," he finally managed to say. You can. Later that day, a trip into town was a necessary risk. He needed to ask some quiet questions about a man with a wagon and a cruel trade. As they crossed the main street, a voice boomed from behind them. "Well, I'll be Samuel Wyatt, risen from the dead." It was Reverend Clay Gibbons, hobbling toward them with his usual air of pious curiosity. His gaze bounced from Samuel to the small girl holding his hand. "Mornin', Clay," Samuel said, his voice flat. "Heard you'd gone to seed after Evelyn's passing." The Reverend went on, his eyes narrowing on Margaret. "Didn't realize you'd taken up fatherhood again." Samuel instinctively stepped half in front of the girl. "This here is Margaret." "She's my daughter." The Reverend's eyebrows shot up. "Didn't know you had one." "She's a recent discovery." Margaret looked up at him, her expression one of pure awe. He hadn't just shielded her. He had claimed her in the light of day. The Reverend huffed. "Well, the Lord does work in mysterious ways." He began to limp away but paused, turning back to lower his voice. "Just watch your step, Sam. There's talk. Rumors that a child was taken from the home under false claims. That a man signed papers he had no right to." The air grew cold. "You be careful what you're sayin', Reverend," Samuel warned, a low fire in his voice. Clay took a step back, startled. "Just tellin' you what the wind carries," he muttered, before tapping his cane and disappearing into the crowd. When they returned to the wagon, Samuel saw it. Nailed to the wooden side was a piece of folded, grimy paper. The handwriting was a harsh scrawl. "You can't keep what don't belong to you. I'll be back for my property." J.W. Margaret saw the tremor in his hands, and her face clouded with guilt. "I shouldn't have asked," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This is all my fault." He dropped to one knee, turning her to face him. "No," he said, his voice fierce with a conviction that shook them both. "Don't you ever say that. For 3 years, my life has been nothing but yesterday. You gave me a tomorrow." Tears welled in her eyes. "Are we going to run, Papa?" He looked past her, toward the endless mountains, the deep woods, the long trail that led back to a life of sorrow. "No," he said, his voice low and steady as bedrock. "This is our ground. We don't run from it." They did not speak of running again. Instead, they worked. As the afternoon sun slanted through the tall pines, Samuel fortified the cabin. He braced the door with a heavy ironwood beam. He dug a shallow trench along the back wall, hidden by the overgrown garden. He retrieved a heavy, rust-jawed bear trap from the shed, a relic from a time when the dangers were simpler, four-legged things. It was the kind of work that left no room for fear, only the rhythmic bite of the shovel into the earth, and the solid report of the hammer driving nails home. Margaret was his silent partner in this grim task. She followed him with a quiet determination that belied her years, handing him tools, holding the lantern steady as dusk began to bleed into the sky. There was a resilience in her, a strength forged in the cold halls of the orphanage. She was a survivor. Night fell not like a blanket, but like a shroud. They ate a cold meal of bread and jerky in near silence, the rifle resting on the table between them like a third guest. And then, just as the moon climbed over the ridge, they heard it. The slow, heavy crunch of wagon wheels, much closer this time. Margaret's small hand found his under the table. He gave it a firm squeeze, then moved her gently behind the thick curtain of the main window. The wagon emerged from the shadows of the trail, pulled by a powerful black draft horse. The man holding the reins was large, his form made monstrous by the moonlight. He wore his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, but Samuel could see a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in a hard rain. His eyes, fixed on the cabin, seemed to gleam with a cold, possessive light. He pulled the wagon to a halt just beyond the edge of the clearing. "Samuel Wyatt," the man called out, his voice smooth and confident. "I'm told that's your name." Samuel stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely at his side. The moonlight glinted off the long steel barrel. Depends on who's doing the iskin. A dry chuckle came from the man on the wagon. The name's Josiah Whitlock. I'm a businessman. And I've come to collect an asset that's gone missing. She's not an asset, Samuel said, his voice level. And she's not missing. She's home. Home. Whitlock's grin was a slash of white in the darkness. That girl is property of the Adeline Institution, signed over to my care. With ink still fresh on the paper, I have a legal claim. I don't give a damn about your papers, Samuel said, taking a slow step forward. You buy children who have no one, use them up, and throw them away when they're spent. That's not a business. That's a sin. Whitlock's grin didn't falter. What I do with my property is my own affair. She doesn't belong to you. She does now. With a motion that was slow and deliberate, Samuel raised the rifle and cocked it. The click-clack of the hammer locking into place echoed loud and sharp in the night stillness. It was a sound that left no room for misunderstanding. For a long moment, there was only silence. Whitlock's hand hovered near the pistol on his hip. Finally, he spat into the dirt. You just made this a whole lot harder on yourself, old man. He snapped the reins, but he didn't ride off. He turned the wagon around slowly, a predator circling before retreating to find a better angle of attack. He would be back. Samuel could feel it in his bones. When the sound of the wagon had faded completely, Margaret emerged from the cabin, a small shadow in the doorway. Papa, she whispered. Will he come back? Samuel looked out into the impenetrable darkness of the woods. Yes, he said, the word heavy with certainty. And he won't come back asking. He did not sleep again that night. He sat by the fire, Margaret leaning against his side, a trusting weight he was already beginning to cherish. He found himself telling her about Evelyn, about the garden she loved, about the sound of her laugh. He spoke of the ache of losing her, a story he had never shared with another living soul. In return, she told him about the girls who were taken in the night, the ones who never came back. She had been next in line. I saw you at the fence, she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. All the other men, their eyes just slid right past me, like I was a ghost. She looked up at him. But you saw me. When everyone else looked. Right through me you saw me. He reached for her hand and held it tight. We'll see this through, he promised, as much to himself as to her, together. But even as he said it, he knew that the coming dawn wouldn't bring peace. It would bring a reckoning. The morning came on slowly, the light a pale, sickly gray that filtered through the cabin's shutters. Sleep had not come for Samuel, nor for Margaret, though she had feigned it, curled tightly on the sofa. He had heard the catch in her breath. With every creak of the floorboards, every howl of the wind, the taste of peace was a new and terrifying thing to a child, who had only ever known the threat of losing it. He stood by the stove, boiling water for coffee that neither of them would finish. His hands, usually so steady, carried a fine tremor, not of fear, but of a fierce protective energy he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer just a man tending the embers of his own grief. He was a guardian standing at the gate. When Margaret padded into the main room, he offered a weak smile. Your stomach still feeling like it's full of hornets? She nodded. Yours too? It is, he said. There was a long silence before she asked the question that hung between them. Will it be today? Yes, Samuel said, the word honest and solid as stone. It will be today. And we'll be ready. The first cloud of dust on the trail appeared mid-morning. Samuel's hand went instinctively to the rifle propped against the doorframe. But the wagon that emerged was Reverend Clay's, his old mule plodding forward with a grim determination. Man owes his debt, Samuel, Clay said as he climbed down, foregoing any pleasantries. And I've been in arrears to my own conscience for too long. He pulled a long canvas-wrapped bundle from the back. Inside were 2 heavy revolvers and a box of cartridges. "I'm a man of God, not a man of war," the Reverend declared. His jaw set. "But I will stand as a witness. And I will not stand idle while a wolf comes for a lamb." From behind him climbed a young man with broad shoulders and quiet eyes, his nephew, James, a boy who knew his way around a fight. Not. An hour later, a second wagon arrived. It was Tommy Marks, the former deputy who'd been run out of his job for refusing a bribe from Whitlock himself. Tommy was a man who wore his integrity like a well-oiled gun belt. He wasn't alone. 2 other grim-faced ranchers stepped down. With him, men who understood that some lines had to be drawn in the dirt and defended with blood if need be. All afternoon, they worked. They turned the cabin from a home into a stronghold, barricading the windows, rigging tripwires to a string of old cowbells. They moved with a shared, unspoken purpose. Margaret watched them, her eyes wide. She saw these men, strangers and acquaintances, toiling under the hot sun, sweating and swearing and digging in all for her. And for the first time, her small shoulders began to square, as if she were finally learning the weight of being valued. As dusk settled, they shared a meal of beans and dry bread around the stove. It was the last supper before the war. "I've never," Margaret began, her voice barely a whisper, "I've never had anyone come for me before." She looked at the faces around the table, then at Samuel. "Why?" He met her gaze. "Because you matter, little one," he said softly. "It's as simple and as complicated as that." The storm broke just after midnight. It began not with thunder, but with the sharp snap of a twig in the woods. Samuel was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. "They're here," he said. His voice a low command. Figures moved in the moonlight, shadows creeping between the trees. Josiah Whitlock's voice boomed across the clearing, arrogant and cold. "You've had your chance, Wyatt. Send out the girl. She's not for you." Samuel yelled back. A flaming arrow arced through the night sky, a streak of orange against the black, and buried itself in the dry hay of the barn. Flames erupted, painting the clearing in a flickering, hellish light. Whitlock's men charged. Forward. The night exploded in gunfire. A shot from James's rifle sent one man sprawling. Tommy Marks, firing with the calm precision of a lawman, dropped another. Reverend Clay stood on the porch, not firing a gun, but roaring passages of scripture into the chaos, his voice a different kind of thunder. One of the attackers broke through the line, crashing through a side window. He found himself face to face with Margaret. She held no weapon, she held the tin ash bucket from the hearth. With a small, fierce cry, she flung the contents, hot embers and blinding soot, directly into the man's face. He howled, stumbling back, and Samuel was on him in a second, the butt of his rifle ending the fight. Through the smoke and the shouting, Samuel saw him. Josiah Whitlock stood by the burning barn, a sick smile on his face, a long blade now gleaming in his hand. "You see, old man, you can't protect her from the whole world." Samuel walked toward him, the heat of the fire on one side, the coldness of his purpose on the other. "I don't have to fight the whole world," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "I only have to fight you." Whitlock lunged, the knife slashing forward, but he was a bully, not a fighter. Samuel was faster. The rifle cracked once, a single, definitive report that cut through the noise of the battle. Josiah fell. The clearing went silent, save for the hungry crackle of the flames. The war was over. Clay put a heavy hand on Samuel's shoulder. Samuel barely felt it. He turned and walked back to the cabin, where Margaret stood in the doorway, her face pale but her eyes shining with a fierce, defiant light. He knelt before her, and she collapsed into his arms. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and innocence, as if he were holding the whole world together. Dawn broke over a landscape of quiet devastation. The air, washed clean by the night's violence, carried the sharp scent of wet ash and pine. The silence that settled over the homestead was different, now not empty, but earned. Samuel stood before the smoldering ruins of his barn, a blackened skeleton against the soft morning sky. He had lost a building, but he had saved a life. It was a trade he would make again without a moment's hesitation. Later that morning, another wagon rumbled up the trail. This time, it was Sheriff Walter Quaid. He was a tall, weary man whose face was a map of all the troubles he'd seen and been unable to fix. He surveyed the scene, the burned barn, the bullet-pocked cabin walls, the shallow graves hastily dug at the edge of the woods. "Heard there was some trouble out here," Quaid said, his voice dry as dust. "The trouble's been handled." Samuel replied, not moving from the porch. The sheriff took off his hat and wiped his brow. Samuel, Josiah Whitlock, was a sickness this town was afraid to cure. He had folks in his pocket, and the law has long arms, but it ain't always got good eyes. He looked toward the cabin door, where Margaret stood half-hidden. "The official report will say Whitlock and his men were trespassing, that you defended your property. It'll be a closed matter." He paused, his gaze softening. "As for the girl, there's no official record of her. As far as the law is concerned, she vanished from the home. If she were to stay here, under the protection of a man folks now see as a hero, I imagine no one would come looking." He put his hat back on. "You treat her as your own, Samuel. The law won't argue." And with that, the matter was settled. Weeks later, a letter arrived, carried by a postwriter all the way from Chicago. It was sealed with an unfamiliar wax crest. Samuel opened it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He read it once, then a second. Time, his breath catching in his throat. He found Margaret by the creek, skipping stones across the water. He sat beside her, the letter heavy in his hand. "That man," he began, his voice quiet. "Josiah Whitlock. It seems he had an older brother, a lawyer." Margaret tensed. "Is he coming for me?" "No, little one. It seems Whitlock had no wife, no children of his own. In a strange will written years ago, he left all his holdings, a great deal of land, just north of here, to whomever was the youngest ward under his charge at the time of his death." He looked at her, the irony thick as molasses. "That's you, Margaret. The land, it's all yours." Her face hardened. "I don't want it. I don't want anything that was his." "I know," Samuel said gently. He picked up a flat stone, turning it over in his calloused palm. "But sometimes the best way to fight a shadow is to flood it with light. That land holds a dark memory. Maybe we could make it hold a good one instead." She looked from the letter to his face, a new idea dawning in her eyes. Home," she whispered. "Not an orphanage, Papa. Orphanages are cold places with gray walls. I want to build a real home, like this one." And so they began. With the help of Tommy, Reverend Clay, and others from the town who had seen Samuel's courage, they broke ground on the inherited land. The sound of hammers echoed through the valley once more, but this time they were not for defense. They were for creation. They built a long, sturdy house with a wide porch and big windows to let in the sun. They called it Grace Haven. The first children arrived late that summer, 2 boys and a girl, all of them thin, quiet, and with eyes that held too much of the world's sorrows. They clutched their meager belongings and stood hesitating at the gate. Margaret walked out to meet them. She was no longer the frightened girl at the fence. She was tall and steady, her hands holding not a bucket of ash, but a tray of freshly baked bread. "Hi," she said, her voice warm and kind. "I'm Margaret. I used to be scared too." She smiled, a real brilliant smile that reached her eyes. "But it's safe here. You're safe now." She reached out and took the smallest child's hand, leading them through the gate and toward the house. Samuel watched from the porch, his heart full to bursting. He remembered her first whisper, a desperate plea to pretend. And now here she was, the promise made real, turning a poisoned legacy into a sanctuary. He had fought a war for one little girl, and in doing so, had given her the strength to build a haven for many. The years passed like seasons turning. The sapling that Samuel and Margaret had planted grew into a sturdy oak, its branches offering shade across a corner of the yard. Grace, haven grew with it. New wings were added, a small schoolhouse with. The sound of children's laughter was built, and the gardens bloomed with a riot of color. Margaret, once a thin girl hiding behind a fence, had grown into a strong, compassionate woman, the heart and soul of the home. Time weathered Samuel as well. His strength faded, his back grew more stooped, and his steps slowed. The fire in him didn't go out. It just settled into a low, steady glow. He was no longer a man of action, but a keeper of stories. On winter evenings, the children would gather at his feet by the hearth, and he would tell them tales of the stars, of courage, and of a woman named Evelyn who once grew the prettiest flowers in the valley. One afternoon, while tidying his room, Margaret found an old cedar box hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Inside were yellowed letters, some addressed to Evelyn, some written as if to God himself, and one thicker envelope on which was written a single word, Margaret. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Samuel's handwriting was still strong and clear. "My daughter," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am no longer there to say it myself. You once asked me to pretend to be your father. The truth is, I never had to. You came into my life like rain after a long drought. You gave me a reason to breathe again, to fight again, to love again. You didn't just ask me to pretend to be a father. You taught me how to be one. Thank you for saving me, Margaret Grace. Carry on our work. Carry on the love. I will always be proud of you." She did not cry. She simply sat there, on the cool floor, holding the letter to her chest, feeling the words soak into her soul like a blessing. Samuel Wyatt passed in his sleep one night in early spring, as quietly as a page being turned at the end of a long and satisfying book. The whole town came to the funeral. The church was filled with the children of Grace Haven, some now grown, all of whom carried in their memory the image of a quiet man with kind eyes. They buried him beneath the oak tree they had planted together. Standing before the grave, Margaret spoke to the crowd, her voice clear and steady. "He was once asked to pretend," she said, "but his love was the truest thing I have ever known." More years passed. Grace Haven became a beacon of hope in the region. One late afternoon, Margaret, now a woman with the first threads of silver in her hair, saw a small figure hesitating at the front gate. It was a little girl, thin and frightened, clutching the cold iron bars. Margaret walked down the porch steps, her own steps slow and familiar. She knelt before the child, recognizing in her eyes the same mixture of fear and fragile hope she herself had once carried. "What's your name, little one?" Margaret asked gently. The girl looked down at her own scuffed shoes. "Tilly." "Hello, Tilly," Margaret said, holding out a hand. "I'm Margaret. Do you need a place to stay?" The girl hesitated, then a whisper escaped her lips, so quiet it was almost lost to the wind. Only if I can pretend that you're my mother." Tears pricked Margaret's eyes, tears of memory, of gratitude, of a circle made whole. "Oh, child," she whispered, her voice thick with a gentle, knowing sorrow. "Here, we don't have to pretend." She took Tilly's small hand in hers and led her through the gate. Behind them, a soft breeze rustled the leaves in Samuel's great oak tree, and the sign for Grace Haven creaked faintly in the twilight. A home, a haven, a promise kept.